All right, another impromptu live stream. I think I plan on doing something similar to what I did last time. I'm not entirely sure yet. The gist of how I think I'm going to start this, just kind of talking about something I had in my mind. I tweeted about it a little bit earlier, and then I'll just go with kind of potentially what's in the chat. We can converse there a little bit. So I see people are rolling in. But the one thing I was thinking about, I'm going to make this a part of another video. So if you see this before that, you'll get the gist of how I'm thinking about this. Is I say this all the time, is that there's this idea I think that we have of as developers trying to capture ideas. Obviously talking about line of business, domain stuff here, is trying to capture ideas generically rather than, or technically, rather than what they really are. So what I mean by this is the prototypical example of this, I think, is a user and just putting everything under the sun as a user. So what does that really mean? Like, what's a user? If we're talking about, say, some type of, I always use distribution, but it could be anything. It could be, let's like talk about a restaurant. It's like, what's a user? Is it actually a patron? Is it a guest? Is it the waiter or waitress? Is it a cook? Like, are they all become users? Not really. I mean, they have different roles and responsibilities. And in that, I think a lot of things becomes then when you're modeling anything, I think it's a little bit misleading to try to model the real world. I'm still working through these thoughts, so bear with me, or how to express it. It's hard to model the real world because it doesn't exist. It exists in the ways that, of the perspective of anybody within that domain and what their role is. So what I mean by this is, as the example, like say we're talking about a restaurant, is somebody that is in the kitchen has a very different perspective than somebody that is a patron, a customer, a guest at the restaurant, and however you want to term them. I'm not in the restaurant industry, so I don't know, but their perspective in the workflows, if you put them in their perspective, is very different versus, say, the host or hostess, or let's say back office in doing the accounting for everything. It's very, very different. Like, I always use distribution because I was in it for such a long time, but I like using it because I'm out of it now, but I have a fairly decent understanding of it. So I always say this. I say that a product isn't a product because, and I've said this in many different videos, but I'm going to elaborate on it a little bit more because I have a little bit more time here, is I always say a product isn't a product because it means different things to different people when you use that word, but it really isn't the same word people would even use. So as the example, let's say you're talking about a product in the sense of sales. I would say, okay, well, they're sales-centric, they're customer-centric. You're selling it to either consumers or, if it's B2B, other businesses. But either way, you think about selling, you think about price tiers, discounts, all these other things related to sales. And somebody in the warehouse that is, say, you know what I mean, fulfilling orders, or maybe they're in warehouse management and understanding where everything's located in the warehouse, how they want to put everything where. The idea of a product, they wouldn't actually even call it a product. They would call what I just said inventory. And they wouldn't be thinking about anything that sales is thinking about generally. I mean, I always say, sure, sales, you think they care about the inventory, about what's on hand, but not really, because the other things that they deal with. But they wouldn't even really call it necessarily a product. It's inventory. So there's just this there's this disconnect where in a system you could just call everything a product. You could have the idea of a singular product, but that makes absolutely no sense. It just doesn't, because it's kind of what I'm alluding to. It depends on how, in what perspective of what person in that space that you're coming from, and what type of solution you're building, and who is it for. If you're building it specifically, oftentimes it's for multiple people. There's different viewpoints involved. So that's why the idea of, I think you could, if you're following me here, you could probably get the gist, which is there's always these generalized ideas that we like to abstract into one thing, when really we'd be much better served being explicit about that thing, even though it represents fundamentally the same idea. How you describe it, the language that you're using around it, most importantly, if you've got enough for my videos, is what are the behaviors, the capabilities that you're providing related to that thing. They will be drastically different. So I think that's where I'm trying to come up with a way of an example of describing this that is maybe not intuitive, but simple to understand, and I can come up with a good example. So that's what I'm still working on, is an example that I can use for that. I see people are joining in here. Yes, I have videos or comments in the video now. At least for now, we'll see what happens. I could switch it out at any given time. Yeah, so that's my thoughts. So you can kind of get some of the gist of this from some of the other videos that I've done semi-recently, talking about more of a focus. If more of a focus is on data structures, then you kind of get into a path of what I'll call entity services. So I know Ian Cooper calls them this. I don't know if I stole it from him, but I still like calling them as well, is that the idea of an entity service would be you have a singular idea of something, let's say a product, in a warehousing system, and it's the be-all, end-all. It's everything related to a product. So it would have everything to do with pricing. It would have everything to do with cost. It would have everything to do with the location of where that product is in the warehouse. Everything related to a product would be in what you'd call the product entity service. And I think people fall down this trap for that reason. But to take it a little bit step further, I think people thinking about entities, aggregates in the domain-driven design sense, still end up going down this road of still building what I'll coin now as like aggregate, be-all, end-all aggregate services, which is the same idea, is that you have this singular, I'm hitting my camera here, you have this singular idea of an aggregate that has these entities in it, and these entities only exist in one place, or the concept of them only exists in one place. So somebody mentioned a simple room booking app. So I'm going with something like, this could even be like hotel or just even meeting room type thing. If you're not sure what it is, call it a service. Exactly, that's what I always say. Everything's a service, right? But yeah, booking app would be interesting. I've never done anything of that nature. But I do think that'd be potentially interesting to model. And I say that immediately because I think, as I mentioned, unintuitive, or maybe it is intuitive, is when you think of, let's say, like meeting room bookings, right? Or maybe you have something along the lines of a little bit more involved, let's say like a doctor's office or anything of that nature, where you have rooms, but then you have and patients in rooms, but then doctors associated with rooms at any given time, or visiting rooms, I should say, with it at any given time, or like appointments, that type of thing. I do know a little bit in this, and people that have done it, not like very, very minor, is that a way to do that you would think is that you model based off the room. Like you would think of the room being the be all end all, right? Where, okay, I have room 123, room A, and that room is booked at this period of time, and maybe say we're talking about doctors, this doctor has to go visit this patient at this appointment time, kind of like an appointment type thing. I think in those cases, the missing part of all that, which is in a lot of cases like this, is actually you could model not the room as being the be all end all, but actually time as a thing, which we don't often think of as modeling based on actual time. So think of it like as an actual calendar. Your calendar is your time of the day of when you're actually booking things. So thinking of things as a component of that, you could think of your aggregate and potentially a room as like whatever blocks of time that you actually have, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. All right, what other comments we got here? I noticed my comments are a little bit slower on the stream than they are showing up in the video than I can see them, but either way. Number of seats. What do you mean by number of seats, Jamie? Yours, model based on the workflow and the data evolves in the workflow. I stopped talking about anything related to real world or anything outside of the workflow. Yeah. So I think, and you'll appreciate this because I just know some of the conversations that we've had before is, so I just keep going with this. You already said, I do not care about the room per se or any data without talking about the given workflow per se. Yes, exactly. So the gist of that too is, and I just recorded a video about this. So this live stream I am going to publish. It'll probably be the following week. But I just did a video about this week, which is not out yet. But at this point, if you're watching this pre-record or after it's already been recorded, you'll see it. Is that whether you are explicitly, like you're saying, we're like knowing it, which you're saying you understand the workflow. I think of a lot of the times there's these assumptions about what the workflow is, or thinking about what the actions are without being explicit about them, which then turns into that's the only way that you really know what the data is that you're actually collecting and what those state transitions are. You have to know them, otherwise you wouldn't have a clue what you're actually persisting. The problem therein lies where you kind of gloss over that. At least I find the problem therein lies is that if you're taking these implied workflows or these assumed workflows, you then are taking the data that's involved there, thinking about what the state transitions are to these entity services. And then there was a tweet by Alberto, you'll see it in my other video, which is alluding to when you're thinking about data structures, it will highlight things, but it will introduce coupling, hence why I'm talking about entity services. So if you just sort of map out what workflow is and understand, okay, I have this workflow, these are the things that are occurring when these types of things happen, and these are the handoffs. What's the actual data required to make handoffs, and what's the data required to make that state change? Or what's the inputs, ultimately, the events, what are the outputs? If you do that, and you start modeling that, you borderline won't even think potentially about aggregates at all. You'll think about just events going out, maybe triggering something else, but you'll see this kind of transition. So if you start thinking about event sourcing, and you were to take an aggregate in a typical way, how you might have it with kind of encapsulating state, and you do that with events, you'll realize that your events and the state that you require within, say, for whatever checks and variants, business rules that you have, becomes much slimmer. Your focus becomes much more specific, and I think that could be a light bulb for people about, which this actually is maybe a good suggestion to exemplify this, is that once you do that, you start realizing that a lot of the data that you care about, or what you think you care about, that really has little value. I think that's where people get tripped up, is thinking about there's all this data and I got these relationships with all these things, when they're just relationships, and without actually capturing any intent or any behaviors that you want to expose, you're really just creating crud. And if you, that's fine where it's appropriate. But a lot of times I think people go down this path of trying to think about, I have these entities, I have these relationships between entities, these aggregate boundaries, and I understand that they are, I understand that they're a consistency boundary, but then throw that all out the window and when you don't actually need it. So you were just saying, I do not think about aggregates but events and moving information from left to right. That's exactly what I'm alluding to. It's exactly. An aggregate it's a means of the end to do that. But yes, it's an event representing state that, yeah, if I have to do this using events, I think will be a really good example. And I could probably do this without really even talking about event sourcing, quote unquote, and describing it that way. I think that may be a way to describe this. So, all right, what else we got here? I also think about relationships as more than this entity is related to that entity, and describe why and how they are related. Elaborate on that a little bit more. Obviously relationships are important between things, but they are, I think, used as a primary driver when they shouldn't be. So in the video that I have coming out, it's like, for example, let's say, or maybe I'll just make up an example right now, is let's say you have a, let me use an example here from that video because it'll be easier. Let's say it was like related to a, kind of like a dinner hosting type of application. And let's say you have a dinner that is like a host is hosting the dinner, and how that would all fit in. Okay, like without knowing other than a host can host a dinner, what exactly, like what's the data involved? Like, okay, there's a relationship where that's the dinner has to be hosted by somebody, which is, let's call them the host. But beyond that, what does that change? Like, I could take everything in most cases and just describe them, if you're just talking about entities, and just plop them all down and point arrows at everything, and that doesn't really change anything. It's not really describing anything other than there's data behind those boxes. There's a host has a name. It has a list of dinners that they're hosting. But like, what are we doing with any of this? Sometimes the relation can be in the aggregate itself. And oftentimes it is. I guess way I'm describing this is that, or a better way of describing this is the prototypical example when people talk about aggregates, which I think is maybe a bad one, is people talk about a shopping cart, right? And your line items in the shopping cart, because like you can't do anything with the line items without having a shopping cart, right? Like that's the idea. So you have your aggregate root, which is the cart itself, and then you do all your interactions with that. If it's just CRUD, then there's no value there. Like there's nothing. There's not, just because they're related does not mean that there's value in trying to create this hierarchy where you could just have data models like when you add to cart, add a new record to your cart. If there's no logic that you have related to making sure that even if you had a check that said, okay, well, I have to, I only want to have the single item, say SKU, unique product, one item. Okay, well, check. Write a database call and check. You don't need to fetch down this entire thing to do that. I think that's where a lot of these examples are. Everybody knows my hate for examples, and I have to produce them too, but it's a little bit difficult to use complex examples like this. Like, you could get away with most stuff with just using your database. The workflow and the data in the workflow should be in the primary driver. Correct. Relationships only give at X given time, but does not really exist sometimes or could stop existing. You could not be chasing relationships per se, especially at the DB level, or be such entropy. Yeah, so the thing here, like, they matter, but most times they matter, especially when you're relating, okay, I have this entity related to this entity, and most of the time, those are used purely for query purposes. Now, I'm not going to get into CQRS, all stuff there, but most of the time, I think if you distinguish between reads and writes, it will drastically change the way that you think about the data that you care about in what given context. It sounds really simple what I just said, but it's actually profound when you really get it about, oh, I had, like, as an example, thinking about an aggregate and all this state, about the things you'll do when it's only for query purposes and it serves no value there. I think that's why I might use an event sourcing example to illustrate this, because it really simplifies that. But I might not even describe it as event sourcing. I might just kind of show it to try to get the gist across. We are trying to model a set of legal rules, and individual rules reference other rules for different purposes. For a long time, there was simply one-to-many relationship between rules. That makes sense. But what's really needed to understand why a rule references another rule. It's described an event. It's calculated the fines, decide what process someone has to go through. Yeah, that's interesting. Can root entity and aggregate contain entity which has many-to-many relationships with root entities? This kind of what I'm alluding to is it can, but for what purpose would be generally for often query purposes, because you want to know, like, not all the time, but I'm using it as the example because obviously you want to know, okay, well, like, say we're talking about a dinner, who's the host of the dinner? You're going to record that. That makes sense. But where are you going to use that? Oftentimes it's for query purposes. So where you decide to record that value can change your design a lot, right? Like, do you need the dinner to have the host, so let's say ID, or does the host have a list of dinner IDs? Like, a lot of this can play out different ways about how you want to reference stuff, but that's, like, I'm not saying it's inconsequential, because it can have, depending on how you want to do things related to reads, but if it has no bearing on, like, if you can't if you can't host a dinner without a host, well, it's got to have a host that's a valid value. So a lot of these useless checks about, oh, well, it has to have, like, you're not going to create the dinner, you're not going to, I got to stop saying create. You wouldn't be hosting the dinner without a host to begin with. Let's see here. So a good example is a user signs up, needs validation, a validation code. In a typical database, you need another table, but in DB, you can just add it to the entity under the user aggregate. That just depends on how you're persisting your data, though. I think a lot of times, if people are using aggregates as their data model and then are using a relational database with that, I think that oftentimes skews people a little bit about how that's modeled, because it may not be exactly the same thing all the time, or it might be easier to think about it as just this object model and then try to finagle that into a relational database. But if you were thinking of it just as just a pure document, it might be easier. But I keep going back to my event sourcing example, which I have created it in the past, that illustrates what I'm referring to. I just might create a new updated version of this. So boom, in the end, it depends. Yeah, the work, I can't emphasize this enough, is that the data that you're persisting, how you persist it, the shape of that data, the data that you care about, is driven by what's happening in the system. It doesn't work the opposite way around. It's not like you're going to create some database schema and say, okay, well, now I know all the things that I need to, all the behaviors that I need to expose. It's the exact opposite. That's why I always find it so frustrating when there's this idea of, okay, I have a CRUD built system. How did it become that way? How did you define all the data? Somebody defined it for you. It was likely defined for you or extracted for you based on the workflow that they're already doing and the business processes that they're already doing, like they would do in Excel. So that's how if you end up with a CRUD-based system, which is fine in places, absolutely, it's driven by workflow or data that somebody knows they need in other places. Your data is driven by workflows. It's driven by the behaviors of or business processes that you either are exposing or not, but that's what it's driven by. Data doesn't come first. It's driven by everything else. All right, let's go here. Could you do a video on design time code generation? Sorry, off topic. Design time code generation. I don't know about that, but I think I've done a video in the past that not related to code generation, but more so, I think it's super underutilized, is driving the client, speaking of workflows, driving the client through workflow at design time. That's what I'm picking up on the design time part of this, is driving the client generally based on the state of the system, a part of the workflow, where they're at in that workflow, and then guiding them based on the actions that they can do, whether it be commands or queries, things that they can do based on what the current state is of the system at that given time. And speaking of business processes and workflows, this probably folds into what I'm alluding to, is if you're capturing that, it's a lot easier to understand what people want to do, the data involved, what they want to do, what the outcome is, which is the event. So a lot of good suggestions potentially about what I'm doing for the next one here. I still got to sort all this in my mind, but you're getting a real-time feel, I guess, for some of the stuff I'm thinking about. In terms of room booking example, could you create a Git project and people can pull requests to help you create it? Yeah, that's actually a really good idea, is to create something that could be really be driven by interactions between everybody, and putting in different ideas about what that may look like. Not that this is a problem, but I would be like in any video that if a place that I don't know, like the video that I'm about to do next probably is going to do this, I'm just making up what should happen in the example workflow that I'm going to create, but I'm going to use it to explain the code and then what everything will look like. So if we were to do something like that, like the room booking example, we're going to make up a pile of different behaviors, capabilities that this thing can do, and rules that we're just going to totally make up, which I don't think is inherently bad. Some of it just might not make a heck of a lot of sense in reality. I say that because, while that may seem like a really simple example, if I were to say, for example, like stereotypical, right, would be, I always use the warehouse. It's like, okay, well, if you're selling something, you can't sell something that is out of stock. It's like, in reality, that's not really a rule unless you are working on something that couldn't be overbooked or oversold, which then you'd have a locking in place. My point being is it would probably be a little bit of a made up scenario, which is fine, but that's fine, I guess. My rabbit consumer throws an exception is now an infinite loop. How to best handle? Don't retry as much. Usually you'll have your consumers. I've done some videos on this. Is that not specifically about that, but about failures for consumers and having some kind of, I would say, default safe strategy on a limited number of retries for whatever reason, and then maybe exponentially backing off those retries, and then just moving messages away to some other dead letter queue so that you can deal with them separately. The thing is that based on what the message is and the volume of the message, you may not want to retry at all, or depending on how important it is to consume that message, like everybody's mentioning in the chat here, it depends on so many things. Oftentimes, like just having a safe bet of retries, but you got to understand when you're creating a consumer, you got to have some idea about the importance of that consumption and the volume of it. Because if you have something that's, say, going to default retry 10 times with exponential backoffs, and there's some significant failure, that thing will never work, and it's essentially just a poison message, you want to bail out as soon as possible so that you can start consuming other messages beyond that one. But again, a lot of this depends on, are you creating queues or topics by SLA and how you're handling them. So a lot of this depends. You got to know the context, I guess. Yeah, put it in a dead letter queue after X retries. I find it helpful to think about the domain models as their own independent things. I can't really see my things in the way that, things that connect together with the data that you populate with them. Yeah, I think it is just understanding at the core where complexity lies. And I think there's a tendency for people to want to think of things where everything's going to be complicated and everything has to follow certain patterns when they just don't. I think that's kind of somewhere of the problem. I've found I would probably go by 80-20 rule, that a complex system is probably 20% of the complexity lives, or 80% of the complexity lives in like 20% of the app. Just general rule of 80-20 rule here, Pareto. So I kind of feel like that. If I think back about large systems that I've been in, I probably say that's pretty accurate. Is that most times people in domain-driven design land call it, like, you know what I mean, supporting boundaries, generic boundaries, etc. They're the 80% of systems, I find generally. They're more there for reference. Supporting is a good role. They're there for reference data. They're there for things that you absolutely need in the core of what you're doing, but they're not really the bread and butter. That's not where the value is. That's not why you're developing the system, but they have to be there, unfortunately, and they're a big chunk of it. Let's see here. Dead letter queues, aren't they great? Yeah, most things you either need to fill to see, so you need to use dead letter queue too often. I think with retries, like I mentioned, with retrying quickly, initially, it depends what the consumer's doing. So if the consumer is, let's say, I use this in a bunch of examples. Let's say you had to reach out to some third-party service. And let's say it's something that you think is highly available. It may still be available, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be performing at the same way all the time during the happy path. Let's say you're calling, I was using one of the recent videos, like you're just doing like a URL shortener with like whatever service. And that's like normally, you know what I mean, less than 100 milliseconds to make that HTTP call, but all of a sudden it starts taking a really long time. It's timing out. I would like to know, I should create a poll about whatever platform that you're using and whatever type of HTTP tool that you use in code, library, whether it's built in your platform or not. Do you know what the default timeout is? And do you set the timeout on every call that you make? Because if you don't, and you have a really busy system that makes something like this where you're consuming a message and it's got to make that call, and you have a high volume and you have to maintain that throughput, sometimes failing quickly and getting it out of the way is the best course of action rather than retries. What do you think about storing the data of entities in binary files by creating a separate file for each entity where it includes one-to-many data and proceed some bits here and there to indicate the length? Not exactly sure what you mean by that. Storing entities in binary files. I'm not really sure. You might have to elaborate on that one. I mean, a rule of thumb is 120 seconds, right? For the timeout? I don't know. I don't know what the default time is everywhere. I know it's way too long for me in almost every circumstance. Like in most circumstances, anything over a second might be horrific. So it depends what it is, but you should use a circuit breaker. So related to one of the last videos I did, I kind of mentioned this, which is fallbacks. And yeah, circuit break when there is a failure, and then just start hitting your fallback. And most things you can have a fallback for. The default timeout for HTTP client, assuming C# is 100 seconds. Good question. Can you make a video about event storming? I don't understand how to define events, commands, aggregates, and meta context if non-technical people don't understand what the terms mean. Yeah, so that's a good idea, and I'd actually like to have, I won't say anything yet because I have it in my list, but that is something that's going to happen sooner rather than later, talking about that specifically. So I will say, though, that the thing that I've found, or that I've experienced, especially if you work in a small team, if you work close in the space that you're in, and you get to talk to people within that space, within that domain, wherever their role is that it just comes naturally to me. I don't often find it is something that you have to pry out of people if you start thinking about and talking about the workflow, and as developers not using technical jargon and trying to think like if you were them and just trying to understand what the workflow is. I think there's this really I say the best developers I know are the ones that have a really good mix. Like if there was a Venn diagram, it's a really awesome mix between technical ability and writing software, but also they have a really good ability to understand business processes and to be able to communicate that without the technical nonsense. And they can do that translation. Those are, I find in my space, those are the people that I think are the best developers. Or at least in my experience, are the people that I know are what I consider to be some of the best developers. Yeah, event modeling, if you're struggling with event storming, different, I think is, maybe I should have Adam on here too. that would be a different perspective to talk about event modeling differently. So that could be a good fit too. At work, we have a microservice architecture with a bunch of, in my opinion, badly split, highly coupled entity services. None of us got too much experience in DD. How can we migrate to a well modularized monolith? So I don't think the issue there is monolith versus microservices, other than the downside, I'm assuming, if you have, like we're quote unquoting entity services, is that you're just now, because they're microservices, assuming independently deployed, is that you're just making RPC calls between them, right? So you have a network call, you're gonna have more latency, a whole whack load of issues, versus if it was all in process, you just wouldn't have some of those issues, but you're still gonna be calling a lot of APIs even within process. So I don't think the answer there is migrating from microservices to a monolith. I think the issue there is understanding, like I was saying at the very beginning of the stream, is that the perspective of somebody or a part of your domain isn't the same perspective elsewhere, and that their concerns are different, and that once you start realizing what those concerns are and what the things that they actually care about and the things that they actually need to do, and kind of how workflow goes from one end to another and what their involvement is, then you start realizing, okay, I have these particular actions or something else occurs, then I care about it in this particular part of the app, this particular boundary. Then you start realizing that that singular entity isn't a singular entity, especially in a big system. So that's where I would go. It's not thinking of microservices or monoliths. I would be thinking about really look at your workflows, whether they're explicitly defined in code or not, even just mapping it out and understanding what the handoffs are and what the data is that's traveling through that whole thing and what you care about or what each part would actually care about. All right, let's keep going down here. What time is it? I got a little bit more time. Let's see here. I have version documents with additional events besides CRUD, so I made an aggregate to manage state and saving events, but I feel my events are a bit clunky, like documents saved. Yeah. So I mean, like you can be like in anything event driven. It doesn't imply obviously event sourcing, and you could be producing events anywhere. I think what you're getting at is, however, the events that you're generating, like documents saved, are more cruddy in nature and probably contain a lot of data. And when that's the case, it's usually because you're using those events not for workflow kickoff, but rather for data propagation, because you have entity services likely or different boundaries that want data a part of their own service for like a local cache or whatever the case may be. And that's oftentimes where you create like these fat events, oftentimes called event carried state transfer. So there's value in having fat events to me in places where you are composing a lot of data together for more reporting purposes. So like you could even be generating like real time, well, close to real time, data sets for reporting using those fat events. And then there's events really that are more slimmer, really just contain IDs, and they're really just for workflow. It's like, this happened, this ID happened. Oh, I already know. I already have the data I need to do my part of the process. So yeah, yep, a lot of RPC calls, latency, fault intolerance. Yep, unfortunately, I think that's pretty common when you have boundaries or entity services that are distributed, and then you have all these. You still have a lot of coupling because you have one service needing to call another service to get data. I would suspect in a read heavy app, which most are, a lot of that querying is for kind of composition of data for UI, or if you're making a lot of calls everywhere for RPC calls for writes, like for commands, that's a little sketchy because of failures and not having one massive distributed transaction. So I don't envy anybody that has to make a lot of RPC calls synchronously from service to service and hope everything goes right, or having to write logic around, well, I got this far and then this failed, so then I have to do this all synchronously. I don't think I did a video about that. I don't think I did a video about RPC calls, and I did a video about entity services quite a while ago. So I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was one of the first maybe, I don't know, 20 videos I did was talking about this. What else we got here? I got a lot of suggestions I got to write down from this. I'm going to have to revisit this video for some topic ideas. Definitely event storming and event modeling separately. There's definitely an idea around creating some like booking type of app, any type of app that could be collaborative. So that is possible as well. I'm also really interested in doing, I don't like the term reaction because I think that's like a YouTube thing. Like, oh, this reaction video. It's not really a reaction, as I would say, like, or maybe I'm being too high on my horse here thinking it's like an analysis. But I've done a few of them. Breakdown. Yeah, we'll go with that. Because I've done some that I'm not really like giving my opinion about what I think is right or wrong or anything. It's just a breakdown. As an example, I did one with the McDonald's where they had a post that illustrated kind of their setup and the tooling they were using. And I was trying to read between the lines about maybe why they were doing what they were doing and why they were using the things that they were doing. So that's cool. So if anybody ever has recommendations on a post that you read on Medium, whoever's development blog, any types of these things, I think they're just really cool. And I wish more companies, did them. And I don't know why they don't. Like Wix.com, they had a couple videos or blog posts, I should say, that were posted that Nathan, I think is his name, posted. And I did a couple of them. Just, they were talking about like kind of their pain points of migrating to an event-driven architecture. And I think there's a ton of value in what they posted because it's anybody that gets into that space, you're going to run into the things that they ran into. And I just kind of took each one of those parts and highlighted either alternatives to what they did or why maybe expanded on some of the things that they're experiencing. So I think those are, I think they're useful to do. And I think they're interesting because it gives me other things to look at. So if anybody ever has any topic ideas or like those blog posts, or we'll call them breakdowns, send them to me on Twitter or in any comment of any video. Yeah, the breakdown. So the AWS, that I think specifically that was the Amazon Prime video. That one was really interesting. And that was the last one I did, and I found that one really interesting to do. Yeah, so the reaction video I did to Milan's video is, I know a lot of people commented that they liked it. I was gonna do another one, which the next video coming out was gonna be an attempt to do that. Although the author of said video that somebody recommended to me to, I reached out to them. They weren't too thrilled about the idea, and I understand why. Like, you don't, I get it. So I guess it depends on what it is. I think there's value in kind of giving a different perspective without trying to demean what the original author was doing. I mean, they had it's their video, it's their full intent. Like, obviously I'd be free to review it, but I don't really want to do it if they don't feel comfortable with it. Having said that, like the Wix.com one as the example is like, they were all for what I was posting and shared it everywhere when I was posting it. So it's nice when that happens. In some companies, I see architects who don't even look at the code and design microservices and C4 models from the ivory tower. Do you think it's possible to design good software in such a way? So I made the comments before that I think anybody making design and architectural decisions should be in the code. I don't think the title, I think everybody should have it. I got to rephrase that. I think everybody can, in a team, have input. I think everybody in the team can have involvement in the overall design and architecture. Even if that input is simply asking questions so you can better understand it. It doesn't necessarily mean to be making recommendations, etc. Do I think the title of architect is weird? Not really. If you have a large system, really large system, and that you have multiple teams, there has to be some cohesion behind what they're like, the overarching idea of what's happening here. So whether we're talking about, okay, well, what's the infrastructure going to look like? Who's going to own what infrastructure? If we're having messaging, how are we doing this? There was the example from, I think it was McDonald's, which was where they created their own kind of SDK that was pulling out schemas from a registry that each team could use. Somebody has to do that. Within your own team, I think everybody can be involved. I think it's only beneficial for everybody to be involved. But the ivory tower, I'm on the outside. I think you don't really feel the pain of what teams or what you're working on if you're not in it. So I think from a high level, it's pretty difficult. Also, a lot of people focus on the big tech companies, but I love videos focused on common man architecture for those of us don't deal with such extreme volume systems. Yeah, I'm with you. I think there's this notion, I guess, that, well, like Netflix or Amazon or whoever does that, so that just becomes the way that things get done. And then you got on the flip side of that, people say, well, I'm not them, so why do I care? I think it actually lies somewhere in the middle. I think there's a lot of takeaways from kind of even when you think about like, oh, the Netflix, whatever, anybody posting stuff like this is generally, it was just like the Prime Video thing was probably one team that was just dealing with the live stream kind of analysis of the stream quality. It was just one team. So it's not like it's their entirety is that. So the whole kind of thing of, well, we're not Netflix, so we don't need to do that, I think is a little bit of a fallacy, because I think there's a lot that can be taken from it, but it's take it within your own context. The same goes is your context matters, obviously. You're just not going to replicate or, try to mimic what somebody else is doing for no good reason. So I think there's value in seeing the practices, seeing what's being done. An example of this, and I've gotten comments on this a few times, so maybe it's not overblown, it hasn't happened a ton, which is people think that event-driven architecture is overly complex for simple systems. What's overly complex and what's a simple system? What my definition of overly complex is and what simple is, we got to define what these even things mean to people. So I think in any type of system where you are thinking about workflows and you are thinking about things happening, events just become second nature to all that. Is there a lot of learning curve to dealing with asynchronous messaging? Absolutely. Like I posted a lot of content on it and some of the kind of the pitfalls. Wix.com did theirs. There's a lot of learning curve there. However, the benefit to it is there's that trade-off, and depending on what type of system you are, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Yeah, I've done a couple different videos on sagas and process managers. I should save that discussion for a separate video, but workflows. I've done a couple of videos on kind of orchestration versus choreography, but I haven't really done a video on which is, because again, it's not either or. And nor would, if you are in an event-driven system or message-driven system, you're likely not to use just like singularly, like I'm just doing everything with choreography, or I'm only going to do everything via orchestration. You'll likely use both, but I don't think I've ever created a video that gives the gist of where I think what's appropriate where. Let's see here. What time is it? I'll give it, I don't know what time I started this thing at. Anybody know how long I've been on here? 56 minutes. Okay, we'll do 5 more minutes. An hour is a good number. And like I said, these are impromptu. I just wanted to do one. I am going to publish this probably in a week after or so. Let's see here. Do you think the lack of tooling contributes to apparent complexity of event-driven architecture? Learning material and tooling and a lot of the ecosystem makes credit a breeze. 100% agree. 100% agree. I can't, right on the money. I think that CRUD is easy to develop for a lot of reasons. One is because it's very easy, I think, to do so, like you said, for tooling reasons. I think also because tooling, I think they go hand in hand a little bit. It's like chicken egg, where Pareto, 80-20 again. I think probably 80% of the tutorials you'll find online related to anything are CRUD driven. So, and then tooling around CRUD, and then everything's CRUD. I'm not against CRUD. CRUD has its place in likely the 80%, but it's not like the be all end all, and you need to be doing it everywhere. In a driven world, tooling 100% is difficult because you don't have the same tooling that you're used to with just, say, database tooling. So think like being able to visualize, and a lot of the things that you end up having to manually create can be difficult. So as an example, how you want to visualize messages there in a lot of metrics, right? Like, and having them in an easy place. Sure, you could be throwing up in whatever tooling you use in terms of like for any metrics, right? Grafana, whatever, you create awesome dashboards to show, okay, we got these queues, and here's the queue length, and here's the average latency, and here's processing times. And you can do all these great things, but you generally have to build it yourself most of the time. Everything seems to be like a one-off that you need to create for everything. And there's no, as I was mentioning earlier, in terms of defining consumers and what retry policies there are, and your dead letter queues, and etc. A lot of this stuff is on a per basis. Some of the tooling, if you're lucky enough, well, because I know I've been told enough now that the same type of messaging libraries that exist in .NET and C# apparently do not exist in the same level or in the same way as any other platform. So when you're looking at things like in the .NET space, a lot of the tooling there is a lot better from my understanding. I can't speak to that, but in terms of management, it's very difficult. There's obviously other tooling out there depending on what you're using. So, for example, like if you're using RabbitMQ, there's different kind of UI and tools you can use, but it's still severely lacking in my opinion. And in Flow, right? Like Solace has a really cool. Solace has some good tools, and they were a sponsor, so shout out to them. But Solace had it. You need something like that where you have so many companies like building on top of tooling. And Service Bus and from your .NET space, all their tooling. I've demoed videos about this, about showing the metrics and being able to see flows. Same thing if you want to set up open telemetry, that's improved greatly depending on where you're outputting that, to visualize that stuff, to see flows of where messages come in and how they correlate. So it's getting there, but it's still not, there's still a lot of work you got to do. What else we got here? All right, a couple more. So one of the questions earlier, I was trying to get a clarification. I meant create a file for each entity's data with all its one-to-many relationships, data, a CRUD app for storage. It's kind of low level. Hope you get the idea because the comment length is limited. Yes, it is limited. I'm still not entirely sure what you mean. Hopefully, I will say, hopefully the video that is just coming out will explain that. Or I'll try to create a video like I was mentioning before that might allude to some of this, that might help out. All right. I often hear you don't need Kafka for this. Yeah, it's like, I don't know. I don't have bad things to say about Kafka. I think Pulsar's cool, which is in Kafka, but similar ideas, so it has some other cool features. I don't follow Kafka enough to know some of the changes that were being made to it. I know that they were coming out with some idea of a not having to be restricted by partitions, so being able to have truly competing consumers. I don't know what they call this. I know I saw a link, I read about it. I really don't have issues with Kafka, even though I might tweet or say stuff about it. It's more so what people try to use it for is where the issue usually lies for me. It's like it ends up trying to be, you end up trying to use it as, I think a lot of people, once they start getting into events, compete in publish subscribe, I think you naturally then start going into, oh, okay, well now I only want to have a message that is defining intent, a command, and I only want to have one consumer for that. And then you start needing to use that same publish subscribe method for that when that's not really what it's for. The same type of thing with trying to use it for event sourcing and using topics as event streams. And I believe now there is optimistic concurrency. Don't quote me. I think there's optimistic concurrency now with Kafka, which it didn't before, so that was a problem. So it's just, and then like the idea that I just often read things about like, oh, well, we had to implement a dead letter queue / dead letter topic. It's like, what are we doing here? But I get it. If you're failing, you want to skip a message. But then, as I mentioned, if you're using partitions because you want to read from topics and you want to consume messages in order by using partitions, then what do you do when you can't consume a message? So there's kind of these conflicting issues, I guess, when people are trying to do different things. It's not Kafka, it's just trying to do things that it might be difficult with it. Why do people think Kafka can be used as an event sourcing database? I don't know. Like I think that comes back to before of topics as streams, it being a log. I view it. I view it not as in being. I view it as a means for communication, not a means for as like a database, as an operational database. I don't use it as an operational database. I view it as a way to communicate with like because publish subscribe publishing messages, having durability of those so that they're not just after consumed they're gone, has a benefit, obviously benefits the partitioning, being able to have a single consumer. There's trade-offs there, but being able to consume in order has benefits. But I don't really view it as at all for the same purpose. All right. So it is a little bit over an hour. I appreciate everybody that jumped on here. I know there's a little over 36 or somewhere around there right now. I have no idea what we're at. Another impromptu. I will be publishing this, so you will see it. I appreciate everybody for jumping on here. I wish I could schedule these. I will try one day to schedule them, but sometimes it's just I got time, so let's roll with it. So hopefully you guys enjoy what I'm posting. Again, if you ever have comments, post them. Send me messages on Twitter for any ideas or things you want me to review. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Hopefully I do this sooner rather than later again. Appreciate it. Thanks.